Welcome to Cordell and Cordell's Men's Divorce Podcast, moderated by Managing Partner and CEO Scott Trout, bringing you information for guys before, during, and after divorce, and everything related to family law. This podcast is not to be taken as legal advice, and no attorney-client relationship is established.
Welcome back to the Cordell and Cordell Men's Divorce Podcast. I'm Scott Trout, CEO and Managing Partner. And as always, we're bringing you information, topics, relevant things for guys before, during, and after divorce. And today is no different. One that comes really out of the news in the last couple of months. We're going to talk about domestic violence, and we're joined by Asa Neff up in New York. Welcome.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So really, we'll get into a little bit kind of more detail, but we're going to talk about Amber Heard and Johnny Depp because the topic really is the taboo topic of talking about domestic violence and guys perhaps being the victim. I've had the experience of it, and I know I'll share some of my thoughts, some of the cases that I've had. But it's one of those, representing men in divorce and modifications. I know you and I see it a lot. We have those occasions where it is one of those instances where, and maybe it's mutual violence. We'll talk, a little bit about that, but it is, it doesn't matter if it's mutual, they're victims, and guys can be victims as well. You've done some research and talking about statistics. Maybe let's start there. Fill everyone in that's listening and watching on the stats on really male victims of domestic violence.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. When the issue of domestic violence comes up, I think there's this idea that it's primarily violence against women. And certainly that's a major aspect of it, and that's a concern. And we're not trying to downplay that at all. But I think people would really be surprised to learn just how common domestic violence against men in an intimate relationship is. There have been studies that found 1 in every 9 men have experienced some level of severe domestic violence at the hands of an intimate partner in their lives. And as many as 1 in 4 men have experienced some lower level of physical violence, slapping, shoving, things of that nature. There's also been studies that showed 1 in every 18 men have been stalked by an intimate partner, which is also a form of domestic violence. The National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey found that 46% of all domestic violence victims are men, which puts it almost on par with how many of those victims are women. When I found those statistics, I was a little surprised, but being what we do and the area of law that we practice and the number of times these have come through my door, it did start to make sense because it is very relevant to divorces in general, but custody matters and the family offenses that we represent our clients in.
Yeah. I've been doing this for almost 30 years. And when I first started, you wouldn't want to talk about it. It's unheard of, right? And it's kind of the very nature of why we started at Cordell and Cordell, and our focus is to kind of break through the stereotypes, the things that, we see every day that judges are presented with I can tell you the example I'm thinking about. And about 20 plus years ago, I had a client who was assaulted. His wife was the aggressor. She took a frying pan and broke both orbital sockets. And so, we go and file order protection, and the judge denied it. And so I filed an appeal, and I went back and the judge, and I said, look, if I represented the woman, not only would I have an order protection issued, but I'd be in prison. I'd be charged with assault, probably attempted murder. I mean, like I said, Judge, you've got to ignore the fact that, I represent a guy and he's the victim. He said, well, why didn't he fight back? And I mean, that's
because we all know exactly what would happen. Right. He did fight back.
Exactly.
That's the real problem here.
Right. And so I think it's such a great topic to talk about because it is that secret that, for whatever it is, you don't want to be a victim. No one wants to be. But for men, it's a manly thing to not be a victim and say that she beat me up or threatened me or I was fearful. There's the big word. I'm fearful, right? For my safety. How could you be? You're 6'3" and she's 5'10" or 5'7" and she's, whatever, very delicate, and but it isn't. It's one of those unspoken secrets. And we've been fighting it, for a very long time, and it's still really relevant. And I think what was interesting for all of you that watched and had an opportunity to see and we'll talk about it now, which is the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial, because it wasn't just about defamation. It was about the relationship and violence. Now, I mean, what I thought was so interesting was no one really, I didn't. I mean, we were just talking off camera. I didn't think about it as a man-woman. I just thought about it as a very kind of violent relationship that they both engaged. And they probably both definitely guilty of domestic violence. So, what do you think?
You're exactly right. And that's common in so many of these cases where they're engaging each other and they're both victims. Who's the aggressor? Who's the victim? That's not always the case. Perhaps not always usually the case. There's two partners in a volatile relationship, a toxic relationship, and they have these instances that come up, these issues that come up, and they get into it.
Yeah, and it's not to, excuse men's behavior as a perpetrator or even women. It's to bring to light that there are victims on both sides, and they lived. I've heard this phrase. They lived in the shadows, and they were afraid for whatever reason to bring it up that I'm a victim of domestic violence. And because of the stereotype that men should be men and they shouldn't be worried about being assaulted and take it like a man. You've heard that one, right?
Yeah, so often. And that was relevant. And that was part of the testimony in the Depp Heard trial. There was a recording, I believe, of Amber Heard saying, "You're the great Johnny Depp. What are you going to do? You're going to go into the public eye and say, I am a victim. Nobody's going to believe you. And you're going to just be embarrassed." And we have so many of our clients come in with the same fear that there's this machismo that nobody wants to say, well, I'm just weak and a victim, and that they're not going to be believed. And that's really a common theme in a lot of these cases. There was one study that found that 73% of men who were the victims of violence were threatened with a threat of false allegations against them if they went to the police. Oh yeah, you're going to go tell the police that I hit you? I'll tell them you hit me first. Yeah. And in 53% of those cases, they made good on those threats. And they did say to the police that they were the aggressor, that they hit me. And
we know for the most part, those guys going to jail.
It's just an unfortunate reality. If the police show up, there's been a fight, there's blood, there's marks, there's things broken, they often jump to conclusions, they'll arrest the guy. And what do you do in those situations? It's really difficult. Yeah.
It's a tough job the police have. I mean, but again, it's this bias that they, we've taught, and I guess in general, we've been talking a lot about this unconscious bias, whether it's on race or gender or whatever it is, right? And I think it does. It's just a natural reaction. I've seen it with clients where she's assaulting my client. She calls the police and says he's threatening me. He comes and like, look, I got scratches on my face. She doesn't have anything on her. I'm clearly the one who's being assaulted. And so what they do is they say, well, ma'am, you just need to leave the house, rather than, citing her and giving her a citation for assault or removing her. And it is an uphill battle, but evidence matters, right?
I had a case very early on in my time with this firm where a gentleman came into my office for we call our consultations, and he was still bleeding. He was still bleeding all over the floor. He had scratches. They were deep. He didn't know what to do. He didn't want to go to the police without talking to an attorney. And I told him, we're going to go right down to the family court, bleeding and all. Don't even bother cleaning it up. We're going to go in front of the judge. The judge is going to have to face you, and it's going to have to do the right thing. And like the example you gave earlier, you'd think that would be open and shut. Yep. It wasn't. Yeah. We were successful in that case, but only after hammering the judge, arguing with the judge, pleading our case, where, if it was the other way around, it would have been no problem. They would get right away, but it's such an uphill battle. but
Right.
one that we can fight and should, because nobody should have to be a victim and nobody should have to feel like there's nothing they can do. So while it is difficult, while it is a battle, we can get it done, and we'll do everything we can to try to help anybody who feels like they're being victimized.
It's the very essence. We talk about the fight to try to, not one, get safety. I mean, that's important, but two, get justice and utilize the law as it's designed. In reality, the domestic violence statutes, codes around the country perhaps tend to be the most over-abused part of the law, in that in many parts of the country, it's called ex parte, meaning you go and you file a notice, and so long as you plead facts that, if proven true, would get you an order of protection, you get one. So here in Missouri, my client can go to court and just fill out an application, and usually, without seeing the judge, just simply get an order of protection. Now, where it falls apart is, and I've had this argument with the judge before, is they understand who the petitioner is, male, female, and even goes into maintenance, where I've had a judge deny my client maintenance who was a stay-at-home dad for 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
The judge said, "Why doesn't he get off his butt?" I said, "Would you say that to the wife?" And the judge kind of got angry for a moment. It was a woman. And then she sat back, didn't say anything. She goes, "You're right." She goes, "If in a real perfect world, I would see petitioner A versus petitioner B, and I wouldn't understand gender. I wouldn't then let stereotypes get mixed into my decision-making. And that's the way it should be in domestic violence, which matters more than maintenance from an immediate safety and protection standpoint, because you're dealing with all kinds of things, with that, involved, like alcohol. You have an alcoholic spouse. That's huge and most prevalent, I think, that leads to these instances in domestic violence.
I agree with that completely. And people who live with an alcoholic spouse, they experience levels of harassment, of uncertainty, that creates so much anxiety that it leads to a very dangerous household. If there's children in that household, it's just terrible. And we see that so often, where an alcoholic spouse is neglecting their duties as a co-parent, duties as a spouse, and creating a dangerous situation, whether it's driving while intoxicated or simply coming home or becoming intoxicated and creating confrontations. It creates an environment that can really be considered hostile and dangerous. And people need to understand that they should be taking steps, particularly if there are children in a home, to protect their children against that type of environment. Mm-hmm. It's the same with domestic violence. And what's interesting is, at least in New York, and I believe most states, just exposing a child, allowing a child to be exposed to that type of behavior, allowing a child to be exposed to domestic violence is in of itself considered child abuse. Wow. And it can come out of your hands if you don't do anything about it. And we have Child Protective Services in New York. And if Child Protective Services learns that there's a history of domestic violence, they're not concerned about who's the perpetrator or who is the victim in most cases. And if nobody did anything to protect the children from being exposed, then they're both guilty of child neglect. Yeah. A child can be removed from a household where that type of behavior is prevalent and allowed to continue. That's
alcohol
or alcoholism, right, as well.
Yeah, alcohol, I think many probably watching, listening now can relate the effects of alcohol abuse within a family, within relationships, what it does to human, what they do. It's an instigator. It's the fuel for fire. It's really interesting. I just met with a client whose spouse is mixing alcohol and prescription medication. And it's really, we talked a lot about a potential for an order of protection to get her out. And it's just a fine line, but it's one of those things. There's help. There's mechanisms within the system, like the orders of protection we talked about a child order protection. But really when it comes to, because I think, as you suggest, even if there are kids involved and you as the father are subjected to violence, there may be an opportunity and a reason to get a child order protection too. Because if mom, is so violent, not only doing it in front of, in the presence of, or even pretend perhaps towards the children, that's an issue as well. Because physical violence, there's, obviously emotional, psychological, and then what alcohol does. But the physical violence part is probably obviously the most dangerous part as we talk about it.
Absolutely. And, we'll have instances of, the most obvious, somebody punching or slapping their domestic partner, scratching and biting, but also throwing objects or just breaking objects in the house, all of which can be extraordinarily dangerous. And if that's going on, particularly in a household with children, you need to take steps to end that situation. So it can be through an order of protection. In New York, we have an avenue through a divorce action for what's called exclusive use and occupancy of the marital residence. So you can avoid having to go and get the order of protection, but still have sole use of the home and get custody orders and other protections in place. And those orders can also direct that somebody undergo a alcohol and drug evaluation, follow the recommendations of any alcohol evaluator, and continue to comply with random testing. So there can be more that's available through certain divorce actions than might be available in the family court. But there's a variety of ways that we can help protect people, and that you should seek that kind of protection.
You mentioned some statistics early on, and even if they're small, minimal, nominal, doesn't mean that we ignore it. And it may be, we talk about sexual misconduct. I met with someone years ago who was drugged and raped, and the woman got pregnant and then sued him for paternity. That happens. And so we're not trying to diminish, violence against women, but the point is trying to bring to light that men are victims as well.
I agree with that completely. And sexual misconduct doesn't always have to be as physical either. It might fall in line with harassment, but I've certainly had cases where a spouse will make constant, threats against their domestic partner and just insults. I had a client whose spouse would constantly be telling them how they're impotent and they can't satisfy them, and they're going to go do whatever they want with whomever they want. And that can also be considered a form of harassment and domestic violence. I had a case very recently, which was very difficult, where the spouse said to her husband that she deserved sexual relations every night, and he was going to do it whether he liked it or not.
Wow.
And listening to it, and I'll mention in that particular case, he had a recording of the conversation. But in listening to it, I couldn't help but think that if the situation was reversed, and if it was a husband demanding sexual favors from his wife every night, whether she liked it or not, he could be arrested, he would be thrown in jail.
Yeah.
But knowing that it's the other way around, his concern was, well, I'm going to be mocked, I'm going to be judged. I'm a guy and I'm supposed to have this libido, and nobody's going to take it seriously. And am I going to go to a police officer and say my wife wants to have sexual relations every night? And he's concerned about the stigma attached to that.
Right. Violence is violence. It does have, it's whether male, female, there are issues on both sides that, rape victims, period, regardless of gender, that's always the fear is, what's going to be done to me on the stand when I report it. And so I think why I thought this was so, and really kudos to Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. If anything positive came from out, maybe they both get therapy, but more importantly, it brought to light violence for men that they can be. And he took it. He brought it bravely. And look, he's probably no gem either, no doubt. But it doesn't excuse either behavior, his or hers. I think that's the positive bringing to it. So with this, what do guys do? How do they protect themselves? What steps should they take? Kind of give them some takeaways today in terms of what they should be thinking about.
Yeah, that's very important, because we've talked a lot about what can be considered, domestic violence, but what do you do about it? So I want to start by saying a lot of this is very state specific. I practice law in the state of New York. I know states have very different laws when it comes to recording. In New York State, we're a one-party consent. What that means is that if either party is aware of a recording, then it's legal and it can come in as evidence. So if I'm having a conversation with you and I have a recording device on me and you're not aware of it, it's still okay. A lot of states don't allow that. And if both parties to a conversation are not aware of it, then it can't come in as evidence. Now, even in New York, you can't plant a listening device. So you can't leave a recording device somewhere and listen to someone else's conversation.
Right.
That would be considered eavesdropping, and that's illegal. But you are allowed to record any conversation you are a party to. So while I don't like having to advise people to record their spouse, sometimes it's the only way to protect yourself. So when I have a client come in who describes some of these circumstances going on, I let them know that you can record. And I've listened to so many recordings that were an integral part of our case of somebody admitting to having hit their spouse, having admitted that they will lie to the police if the police ever show up. And that was the evidence that really saved our clients. So they can be very important tools when there's a he said, she said situation, and we all kind of know where that could end up.
Yeah, my client got in a fight on the driveway at their house. And she slapped him, punched him, kicked him, spit in his face. Then she called the police and claimed he was the aggressor. We went to the video and said, look, by the way, we have a security camera. And they looked at it and they took her away. So, I mean, they are valuable pictures. I know you think about Johnny Depp showing pictures of him, with bruised red eyes.
And what was important there is that he took them and he kept them.
Right.
So, it doesn't matter how old it is, because if we're talking about a history of domestic violence and a history of these things going on, then if you have pictures going back in time, that will help with your argument down the road, and it's additional evidence. So, if you have those pictures, you need to make sure to keep them safe and note when they occurred, what exactly occurred, and keep that fresh for the memory. Yeah. I would also note that, just keeping a diary of, it's a shame that these things go on for so long, but if you keep a diary with times and dates and specific information, and you can testify down the road, if necessary, that you kept this diary, you took it as the situation was happening. The next day, you wrote it all down. A court can judge your credibility and utilize that as well as some form of evidence.
Yeah. And, it's, you talk about contemporaneous is the word we use, contemporaneously keeping notes. And that would include telling someone, reporting it right away to a friend, a neighbor, a relative, even the police, not something waiting months or weeks, whatever it is beyond, is taking something immediately and going to someone like Johnny Depp. It's just, front and center. She throws a bottle, cuts his finger off, gets people involved immediately. Of course, he had to go get medical care. He could have ignored it and just, laid where it is and done nothing. But those are the things, is take action immediately, especially when your physical safety's, at risk.
Agreed. And for anybody who's going through these issues, if they're not ready yet to take certain steps, I would encourage them to speak to a counselor, a professional who they can talk to. And that can also help build a record in and of itself, because a counselor's notes from their sessions will confirm that these were being reported contemporaneous with when the events happened, and that he was struggling with how to deal with these things. It explains perhaps why he wouldn't have gone to the police or talk to an attorney right away. Dealing with a counselor and try to work through some of these issues will also be able to help keep a record of when the events occurred.
It's so big. I mean, it's just, and as we wrap up, talking to an attorney like you And just find out what your rights are. Like I said, I met with someone recently. They just wanted to know what they should do, what they could do. That doesn't mean they are going to. And then we can provide the resources, the information, get them to the help that they need. Maybe perhaps, suggest and make them feel comfortable leaving the home if they need to, because that's always the first priority, is leaving for safety, number one, and then taking steps for law and legal and those types of things. So obviously, as you mentioned, speaking to attorney is also an important piece here.
It's a very important piece. And we're never here to push somebody to do something they're not comfortable with. We're here to provide counseling. That's our very first job. We're counselors, and we can try to help give them all of their options, help make them as safe as possible, and help prepare for whatever might come in the future.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've said that to clients before. When I look on the wall of my law license, it says not just attorney at law, it says attorney and counselor. Not that we're a social worker or a therapist, but the point is that word has meaning. I mean, and doing this podcast, I think, is part of that, is to help counsel people in the right way that they should do and the help that they need and get them the direction that they should go. And it may mean that they do nothing in the law that would, I guess, trigger our law license and things like that. So, Asa, good stuff. Great topic. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Well, you now heard it. You've got some walkaways, some things that you can do to protect yourself. Contact a lawyer, and we're available. You can schedule an appointment right on the website online. You don't even have to pick up the phone. Calendar's right there. You pick your city. You can meet with an attorney around the country virtually, on the phone, in person, whatever is convenient for you. Go to CordellCordell.com. You can give us a call, 866-DADS Law, if you want more information. But also just check out our YouTube channel. It's filled with things just like this, podcast information. You can subscribe to the podcast on Apple iTunes as well, and you'll get notified every time something's dropped. So until next time, have a great week.